Hello everyone, welcome back to Dark Night Tales. Before we dive in, please show your support, give this video a like and be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. So let's get started. The first story. Every night one person in town goes missing. And I think I'm next. I'm writing this as a last-ditch attempt. And I'm a bit rushed for time, so I'm sorry if this is a bit jumbled as it's almost midnight. Right, I need to give you some context. I've lived in New Zealand all my life. Never staying in one town or city very long. But one thing I always told myself was I would never return to my hometown of Lathven, a small town situated right under a well-renowned ski field. I'm getting off track. One thing I was always curious about was the disappearances. Every night at exactly midnight, a shriek, scream, I don't know how to explain it. Something between a dying cougar and a wolf's howl. Regardless of what it sounds like, it really scared the SHD out of me as a child, but eventually, we got used to it. One thing I never got used to, however, was the fact that every night, a few minutes after the ominous howl, a shriek could be heard, a very human shriek, but never the same. Sometimes it sounded young, sometimes old. And a person, fitting the shriek, was always gone by the time dawn rose. I never truly questioned it though, thinking maybe it was some animal that sounded human and could mimic? That alone was scary enough for a 5-year-old. But what truly made it sink in what was happening was when I was in year 6, 5th grade for you Americans. My best friend, Tim, disappeared after a very loud childlike scream had been heard the night before. You see, he lived next door to me. That's how we met after our fathers went to a barbecue and started talking. After that, we were inseparable. I think I finally realized that day, that what my naive self had believed to be people moving away, wasn't the case. And that my parents had told me that to calm my young mind. That dawning realization was the day I vowed I'd leave as soon as possible and never return. But first, I needed answers. Quickly I found that no one was going to be volunteering any information, and certainly not my parents. I never did find out much from my snooping, but I think at some point or another I lost interest and just accepted it. I grieved my friend and moved on after that, but the dread within me never went away. It never settled no matter how many nights I was awoken by screams. I didn't wake every night, as sometimes the screams were further or closer away. I was 18 when it happened. I jolted awake and was instantly on my feet when I heard the terrible howl. It was right outside, likely in our backyard. Now was my chance. I dashed over to my window, adrenaline pumping. But when I got there, nothing. I went to lay back in bed, heart thumping still when I heard a creak. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. Normally it assumes it was normal house noises, as there was a slight breeze outside, but this was not a normal night. The howl, or whatever it was, had never sounded that close. I sat up, too scared to move. I felt like a 5-year-old child once again, all the fear bubbling back up. What happened next is something I will never forget. In moments I was up out of bed, grabbing my baseball bat and storming into the hallway. My ears rang from the loud, pain-and fear-stricken cry I had heard come from my parents' room. I ran in to see my mother huddled in the corner, curled in a ball and shaking. Tears dripped from her eyes, her hollow eyes. I don't know what she saw, but after that day it was never the same. I went to the police the next day to file for a missing persons, but I knew nothing would come of it. My father, the one who taught me to shave, the one who brought me my first beer, and my first suit. He was now a memory, a painful memory that I'd be reminded of every time I saw his face on the community board, big red words reading "missing" underneath. We all knew that he wouldn't be found though. The police didn't even look anymore, because they never found anything. The last time I saw my mother was 2 days after my father was taken. She was being put in the hospital for a psych evaluation at my request. I will admit that I don't know how it went, because that day I had packed my bags and I was gone. I do still feel bad to this day, but do I regret it? No. After I'd left town I had nothing but bad luck. No one would hire me and I ended up homeless for a while. Then we flicked to almost a month ago when I broke my vow and came crawling straight back to this hell. Anyways, that is plenty of backstory. Now, you may be wondering, how do I know I am next? this thing is methodical. And it seems to be smart. It goes down street by street, house by house, but never in perfect order, probably to still have the element of surprise. But it never does the same house more than once every few months. It's almost like it farms us. And despite the number of witnesses, we still know almost nothing about this hellhound. Most of the witnesses are so traumatized in the moment that they bite off their tongue, or at very least are so deeply disturbed they refuse to talk about the topic and will shut down at the very mention of it. One new thing to note in this town is a new church of sorts. I haven't been, but it is more popular than Christianity in this town. It is settled in an old Victorian-style chapel just a few streets down from my parents' house. They call themselves the Silent Ones. They seem to worship the evil that stalks this town, but to join you have to have had a family taken. The ones who see this thing are considered chosen and make up the majority of the priests. Hence the name. I refuse to step foot in those doors. I've never been a religious person, and I sure as hell I'm not going to worship the creature that preys upon this cursed town. When I got back, I was told by an old family friend, one of the town's elders, that my mother had been taken by it a few months back. I couldn't even say I was surprised. It got everyone eventually, even the members of the Silent Ones it seemed. The only people it didn't seem to take were pregnant. Couldn't have itself killed the source of its future food, could it? I've been here for just over 2 weeks now. I am living in my old home and even the slightest noise wakes me in a complete panic. The last 2 nights I haven't even slept. Running on monsters and coffee, every night I hear it loom closer and closer, slowly taking people from my street again. And I just know I'm next, and if not, it will happen soon. Every house has one taken once every rotation. I have a few things to help me, for when that creature comes knocking. I brought myself a hunting rifle. It's only meant for rabbits, but it's something. At this rate though, I may end up just using it on myself. I'm so scared, guys, I can't let it take me too. Here is what I know about this creature. It is lean and... Oh no! No 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 no! Not tonight. Please. I just heard its banshee scream from outside my window. It seems I've run out of time. Someone, please help me. I just know this gun is useless. I'm going to post this now. I can hear something creeping through the house, just out of sight. I've got my gun loaded and now all I can do is pray. If I don't reply to this post by morning, no, I didn't go missing. You know the truth. Wish me luck. The second story. I retrieved my trail cam from the woods. I should delete the photos I captured. Predators are an uncommon sight where I like to go hunting near the Rocky Mountains. I wanted to see what exactly I'd be contending with during the hunting season, so I decided I would place some bait fairly deep in the woods. Whatever would take the bait would be photo captured on my trail cam. I drove to a heavily wooded stretch of a logging road and parked my truck on the side of the road. The fresh air was great to breathe in, and even from the road you could hear the chirps of birds and insects. This area was new to me, recommended by a family friend. He claimed I'd see lots of bears here. I kept the bait, a few pounds of meat slabs, sealed up in a bag while I trekked into the woods with the bait barrel. I hiked in about 15 minutes from the road and reached a small clearing that I was satisfied with, scanned the ground for any flattened grass, animal tracks in the dirt, and any sort of droppings nearby. I found some tracks that looked like a wolf had gone through here fairly recently. No matter, my gun and pepper spray were with me as well. I set up the bait rather quickly, and fastened my trail cam to a tree. The camera itself was well hidden thanks to how the branches hung on the tree. After parking the truck I had already begun finding some discrepancies from my hike here last time. There was an eerie silence that carried through the woods. No chirping, nothing. I could hear every step I took almost louder than before. Some people find the complete silence to be tranquil, but I'm not one of them. I felt more alert this trek. That alertness made the path to the trail cam feel that much longer. The silence persisted as I finally saw my equipment in view. The barrel had tipped over and was scratched up. The stench of something like a carcass smacked me in the face. I got the gun ready, sure that I had to shoot something. No rustling in the bushes, so I proceeded carefully. The bait was still there. Of course, it had begun to spoil. That is where the foul smell was coming from. Oddly enough, there were spindly hairs that were stuck to the bait. I plucked one off the bait. It had to have been almost a meter long, fully unraveled. What kind of hair was this? Disappointed, and still a little bit on edge, I hastily grabbed my trail cam and left everything else behind. I could hear something trudging through the trees in the distance, so I kept the gun at the ready as I left. It was somewhat persistent, as I could hear the sounds of grass being pressed down, shrubs rustled, and twigs and branches being stepped on for most of my way back. All the noises were far, but persistent. I felt watched. I picked up my pace, and eventually got to the truck. The minute I slammed the truck door, I heard a strange yell in the distance. My heart skipped several beats and I started up the truck despite the feeling of my blood nearly freezing. I stepped on the gas and made my way back home. I had about an hour's drive back to my home and my thoughts raced on the eerie feeling, the fact the bait wasn't taken, the strange hair, and that awful sound. Hopefully it'd all be solved with the photos on the trail cam. At record speed I darted into my condo and got the trail cam's photos loaded onto my computer. There were lots of photos that were taken, so I started from the top. A part of me wishes that I didn't apostrophe T. The first batch of photos were primarily just photos of the bait, no animals or anything. Strong winds, swaying trees, things like that probably tripped the camera. These photos persisted for a few days. About a week or so in, there were photos of birds landing on the barrel, and other small critters that I could see through the trees. There was even a nice buck in the area that walked through the clearing. It wasn't until the third week that I finally saw what I was looking for, a bear. Big one too. Looked like it sniffed the barrel, but then the photos picked up something that confused me. The bear took off swiftly. I could see photos of the dirt and leaves being kicked up. There were a few incidents of this event. A bear would investigate the barrel, notice something out of the camera's range, then run off. I started to get an explanation from the photos about 2 days after the first when I saw something I'm puzzled by. In one of the photos, wrapped around a tree, looked like a human hand that wasn't there before. I reviewed the cluster of photos taken at one of the later moments. The bear sniffs the barrel, and the thing's hand hits the tree and the bear takes off. The bear didn't even stand its ground? A few days of photos were uneventful until 4 days before I picked up the trail cam. I was both confused and terrified by what I saw on the camera. From out of the clearing, I saw what I can only describe as a hairy, naked man crawling on all fours towards the barrel at 4 a.m. The hair on his head was almost the entire length of his body. The thing was emaciated, and moved abnormally slowly judging by the photos. I almost leapt from the computer chair upon looking at it. There's no explanation for something like that to be in the woods at that time. It reached the barrel, and began scratching it up. The swipes it took at the barrel were cat-like, and swift. I took notice that when this thing stood up, it was at least 7 feet tall. It knocked it over, and began frantically pulling all the meat bait out of the barrel. It held it in its hands and threw it on the ground. It cocked its head towards the camera, as I could see the shine in its eyes reflecting. This thing looked back at the meat and began rolling on top of the meat with its mangy body. It stood back up and unhinged its jaws to let out what I can describe as a scream. My mind paired that scream that I had heard upon leaving with these photos, and I nearly lost consciousness. I wanted to stop looking at the photos and turn it into the authorities, but what would they say anyways? I still had 40 photos to go. I took a few hyperventilating breaths and pushed onwards. It attacked the barrel some more and its attention then shifted to the trail cam. I think it may have noticed it, because it began to stumble towards. After taking several irregular steps, it peered down towards the camera. I could see its warped face coming in from the top left angle of the photo. Its eyes were abnormally spaced apart, closer to that of a goat's, but not fully on the side of its head. Its long hair swayed in what I assume was either its abnormal movements or the wind. Eventually, after investigating the camera, it crouched back onto all fours and scurried into the trees directly away from the camera. There were a few photos remaining of mundane activities much like before this horrific encounter. Nothing touched the bait, and it was pretty clear why. If I knew that thing was out there, I would never have gone to get my trail cam back. I'm certainly never going back there, ever. I want to delete these photos, but a part of me thinks it's worth putting a case together for the sheriff or something. It was a close call, Who knows what would have happened if I had gone 4 days earlier to grab the camera. I probably wouldn't be here and able to be writing this stuff. The third story. I'm a wedding photographer and I've seen weird things. Hi everyone, long-time lurker on Reddit, and first post ever. To introduce myself and give a bit of context, I am a French wedding photographer and I work mainly along the Atlantic coast. I am 32 years old and have about 170 wedding reportages completed. I am not a strong believer in the paranormal, although I am very interested in the subject. It's something very far from my mind when I am working on a wedding report. However, as I read this sub, I began to rethink on some personal experiences, most of which took place in the course of my work, during weddings. The ghost bouquet, the first memory that came back to me is quite recent. In October 2021 I had a wedding in a castle, and there had been a small incident at the start of the day because the bridal bouquet had been forgotten, or in all was nowhere to be found. The bride had had to make her wedding without it. The next day, starting the selection of the photos on my computer, at the time of the exit of the ceremony, where the couple goes up the aisle among the guests. I was at the back of the room and I took photos of them facing me. There is a series of 8 photos taken from this moment and on only one of them the bride is holding a bouquet. On the 7 others photos she has her hands totally empty. At the time I didn't ask myself any more questions about this and joined this photo to the bride and groom in the selection. The bride phoned me almost immediately, completely taken aback, and asked if I had photoshopped her bouquet in her hands. Obviously I said no, since I had never seen it anyway and therefore never had a picture of it. Her reaction made me realize how strange this little detail I hadn't really noticed was when I thought about it. It's bouquet, why on only one of the 8 photos when they were taken in a burst, so less than a second apart between each? Because the bride did recognize her bouquet, it was by no means another bouquet taken from the floral decoration. She also assured me that she was empty-handed during the moment. The discussion remained on hold, where no one had any explanation and where to bring up anything supernatural would have been totally inappropriate of me. Kid's disappearance. Another equally strange story from a few years ago. The cocktail was held in a large room, because it was raining all day. At a certain point, a person started to panic because their son was missing. Little by little all the guests started looking for him. Searching every nook and cranny of the reception hall, which was relatively empty of hiding places. The kid was nowhere to be found. A few men even left in the rain to see if he hadn't had the idea of going out despite the bad weather, but nothing. I would like to point out that the room had no particular nook or long tablecloths on the tables. Absolutely no place a child could have been hiding. After about 20 minutes, I heard exclamations in the middle of the room where a crowd was gathering. The child was sitting idly on a chair in the middle of the room, absorbed in his portable console. As if he had always been there. His parents asked him where he had been and the kid didn't seem to understand a word of the situation. He explained that he hadn't moved from his chair, right in the middle of the room, and hadn't seen or heard the panic and calls while the 120 guests were looking for him. On the other hand, 120 people did not see him in his chair for 20 minutes when he was theoretically in plain sight. Having been involved in the search as well, I'm pretty sure the kid wasn't where he reappeared. Again a weird moment. Babies cryings. One last, shorter anecdote to finish. During a wedding mass church celebration, there was, as often, a baby screaming in the audience. The French churches, very large and made of nude stone, make the sounds particularly resonate, and the tears of the babies crying was frankly annoying. Being the only one who could move around during mass, I looked, a little annoyed, where the cries were coming from. There were not many guests, 60 people maximum, and the screaming baby could not be located. When going to the back, the crying seemed to come from the front and vice versa, and when I moved, it always seemed to come from elsewhere. People didn't seem to particularly look for the source of the noise, but I could see they were just as annoyed as I was, as were the priest and the bride and groom. As I walked out of the church, I watched carefully to see if any guests were going out with a baby. And none seemed to have any, either at this time or throughout the wedding day. The mute. Certainly not my most exciting anecdote, but still curious enough to write it down here. During the celebration in a church, 4 years ago I believe, a curious event happened that I did not immediately interpret it as strange or paranormal. Towards the middle of the ceremony, The bride and groom were kneeling, listening to the priest's homily. The audience was very large and therefore relatively noisy, whispers etc. I was myself at the back of the church near the main doors taking wide shots, when suddenly, for barely a second, there was no sound. Not like everyone's been silent, but like we've pressed the mute button on a remote control. No more sound of the priest's words, no more noises coming from the guests, no more noise from outside. Nothing, absolute white sound for a second. Didn't have the time to realize what was going on, then it was already over. At first I thought it was coming from my body, kind of like yawning and your jaw blocking your eardrums. But when the sound came back I noticed that all the guests were looking at each other and that the priest had lost the rhythm of his recitation, obviously disturbed. The priest nevertheless continued as if nothing had happened and people ended up returning their attention to the ceremony. When we left church, some people discussed it briefly and I was able to talk to the groom about it. But they all gave little importance to it, like yes, that was weird and that's all. It's pretty amazing that people are going through a bizarre experience and not even looking for a plausible explanation. The bells. Last winter I was working on a very big and beautiful wedding on the grounds of a huge castle. To situate the setting, in the middle of a gigantic forest park, the castle is made up of the main body, 4 floors, and whose facade is surmounted by a campanile, a tower with bells. On either side of the main part there are 2 wings forming a U, one serving for the cocktail and the other for the meal. In the middle, a superb French-style garden with narrow alleys of white gravel. I have worked on this site several times before, and in the summer, when everything is in bloom and the sun goes down late, the place is beautiful and warm. But at this wedding, in winter, when night fell around 5 p.m., when the icy wind froze us as soon as we stepped outside, the atmosphere was much more gloomy. To finish with the context, the main part of the castle is more or less abandoned, the lower floors serve as a shed, and those at the top are in such bad condition that it is forbidden to access them, and the accesses are condemned since a long time. However, from the outside it is not visible and still look beautiful. During the meal, which began around 8 p.m., there was a power cut, due to an overload of the DJ equipment. I remember that the wedding planner was very angry with the manager of the estate because it took more than 15 minutes to restore the power, which is extremely long when we have 200 guests in the dark. Once the power returned, the evening could resume. But at the time of dessert, bingo, another power cut. The wedding planner calls the manager again, who lives in an outbuilding next to the castle, and I go out into the central garden to smoke a cigarette while I wait. Several guests were already there to smoke as well. I join a group, all covered from the cold, and we start chatting. We were in total darkness, and without any cloud we could see the stars shining in the sky. The wind was blowing quite hard into our ears, but suddenly a bell sounded, beaten on the fly, as if they were caught in a very powerful draft. It reminded me of war films where, especially in France, church bells were rung on the fly to alert the population. It wasn't a melody, just bells shaking as loud as they could. As it was windy, I just thought to myself that passing through the bell tower must have ringed the bells. In spite of myself, I found the sound disturbing. It must have lasted barely 10 seconds at most. Once the power returned, we finished the meal, the cake, the coffee. I then went to chat with a DJ who was trying to figure out why his equipment was blowing the power, because he absolutely wanted to fix the problem before the start of the dance floor. I watched him make his adjustments, when bam! Another cut. This time people were starting to get annoyed, so I followed the wedding planner, whom I know well, who was so upset that she wanted to go see the owner to tell him to sort it out. I let them explain themselves as I followed them into the basement of the castle where the circuit breaker was. We were in old cellars with a central hallway too low for me to stand on, and small rooms on either side with rotten, damp walls, enlightened only with the flashlight of the owner. Once the power was restored, the light came back in the hallway and we left in the opposite direction. Looking out of curiosity in the cellars, I saw rows of empty bottles, rotten furniture too, and in one of the last before the exit, 3 huge bells, placed on a pallet. I stopped to ask him where they came from, and the owner explained that they were from the campanile. I then told him about the sound of bells we had heard earlier in the evening, and he explained to me that it was impossible because these bells had been there for over 30 years, since the beam that supported them had collapsed after taking water and rotten, and that he did not own any other bells, even decorative ones, on the estate. I didn't insist because we had to get back to the party in a hurry, but here too the question hung in the back of my head for several days. The dress. During a country wedding in the south of France, which was held in a small estate-type renovated farmhouse and country atmosphere, the day went smoothly, in simplicity, pretty secular ceremony under the old oaks just in front of a small pond with dark water. After the meal, and before the dance party, the bride had planned to change, removing her large and uncomfortable princess dress, paid a fortune to wear a lighter, and more practical, little white dress for dancing. The next morning, I slept there because I was far from home. I learned at breakfast that at the end of the evening, when going to bed, there had been a problem because on returning to the marital suite the bride had noticed that her dress, her veil, her bouquet and her shoes had disappeared. Since my room was on the other side of the building I was not aware of any of this. A few guests had looked right to left to see if the things had been left in other rooms or in a car, but given the late hour, fatigue and alcohol, the research was quickly abandoned, and decided to see it the next day. Eventually people started looking after lunch, with the bride continuing to make sure she had locked the room, and that the key hadn't left the groom's jacket pocket afterwards, until he used it to open it on his way to bed. The room was upstairs and the window was closed. Honestly, I didn't care too much about it at the time. Lost items are very common at weddings. A little later some childs arrived shouting that they had found the dress. They explained that it was floating in the pond in the gardens a little further away. Everyone went there, including me, to see that the dress was well in the water, part on the bank and the majority submerged. The bouquet floated not far with the veil of tulle entangled around. From that moment, the bride became hysterical, wondering who had thrown the dress here and how the thief had gotten to it that evening, as she was absolutely certain the drawer was locked, that she was sober and that she had checked several times that she had closed well, in particular because her jewelry was also there. The shoes were never found, and I never dared to ask for the story again for fear of stirring a knife in the wound. This story is undoubtedly less mysterious than the others because it is easily possible to imagine a rational explanation despite the statements of the bride. The fourth story. The room at the end. My father grew up on a farm in southern Illinois in a town called Lebanon. My weekends, holidays, and summers were frequently spent down there, from when I can remember, through high school. Some of the trips from Chicago to there actually qualify for some of their own stories, but I'll leave that alone for now. The farmhouse was a large Victorian style with veranda stretching across the front that was perfect so sitting in the later afternoon and evening, especially during the spring and summer, to watch the fireflies dancing across the lawn. Now the farm did have a few oddities. Directly across the driveway from the veranda was an apple tree, laying on its side after the trunk had been hit by lightning. The tree still turned green, bloomed and bore fruit, although it only seemed to be connected to the trunk by a few pieces of bark. There was about 200 acres of hardwood at the back of the property that was split in half by a creek that flowed through it. Now that forest held its own secrets. Overall, it was as typical a farm as you could expect anywhere in the Midwest. It grew sweet corn, feed corn, and soy, hogs, chickens, had a barn, and old grain elevator. Everything you would expect to see. The bedrooms upstairs were large and spacious. Two of the rooms held large king-size brass beds. In one of the rooms was an oak and glass case that was basically airtight and held my father's collect of all the Edgar Rice Burroughs pulps for Tarzan and Barsoom, my perfectly protected treasure. The most interesting feature of all three bedrooms, however, were the closets, and to quote a line from British science fiction, they were bigger on the inside. In fact, no matter how many times I explored them, I never seemed to get to the end, and there was always something there that definitely not been there before. I'm sure both an archaeologist and a cultural anthropologist would have a field day in them. These closets were larger than most people's bedrooms by current standards. The most interesting of these bedrooms and closets was the one that was at the front of the house, at the end of the hallway. It was there we found the most treasure, and seemingly without much looking. Starting with a stereoscope and slides, then finding an 1812 primer in excellent condition, a Civil War musket and a Civil War Union artillery field manual, with the name of the general officer written inside. Finding all these items was fun and seemed never-ending. There was an issue with this particular closet. The door would never stay closed. My sister and I frequently stayed in that room, which by the way stayed significantly colder than the rest of the house year-round. You could lock the door with the key and it would be open the next time you walked into the room. We have put hook and eyes, hasps and locks and nothing worked. The door would be opened. The door to this closet had been like this as long as anyone could remember. It was starting to freak my sister out and I have to admit I wasn't immune to this either, so, one afternoon we put a couple of padlocks on the door, barred and locked it, then finally moved the several 100-pound 5 feet long chest of drawers in front of it and went to bed. In the morning, when we woke up, the chest was back where it belonged, the padlocks were off and, on the chest, the bar was standing in the corner with the lock attached and the door to the closet was wide open. After this we never tried again and decided to live in peace with it. We then continued to glean wonderful treasure from it. However, after my grandparents died, my great-aunt and uncle somehow came up with a deed claiming the farm was theirs. During my travels back and forth across the country for the Air Force I intended to stop and get the case with my father's pulps. Unfortunately, like my grandmother, my great-aunt developed Alzheimer's and had invited several young people to help out. This resulted in the farmhouse getting burned to the ground with everything inside lost. Fast forward to about 7 years ago, I received a summons from the city, that they were suing me and all the remaining heirs for the property, as they were claiming it by eminent domain. Because some developers wanted to put in new housing and a lot of houses could fit on over 400 acres. After all the legal hoopla and they paid me my pittance of a share, in all honesty I had to give them fair warning, knowing that whatever had been there, was still attached to the land. Not only that, but a greater warning about the forest. Remember I said the forest held its own secrets. There are 2 untouched, undisturbed Native American burial mounds out there. I hope for the new homeowners' sake they paid attention. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share and we will see you in the next video.